All right, guys, we're going to go ahead and get started. We got to have everybody go ahead and take a seat. And what I'm going to have you guys all do is turn over to the second page of your notes. That front page had your discussion questions and some of our main objectives for tonight. Starting on page 2, which is unofficially page 2 because it's not actually printed at the bottom, we're going to introduce the concept again of philosophy and religion. We talked a little bit about that last week, and I want to spend a couple more minutes talking about the relationship between the two. Last week, we distinguished two important terms, philosophy of religion on one hand and apologetics on the other. Philosophy of religion is rationally thinking about the category of religion. It involves taking the category of religion, thinking rationally through it. Apologetics is a little bit distinct. It is making a rational defense of the Christian faith. Last week, we focused mostly on apologetics. We talked about what it is. We looked at how it was used through the Bible. We did a historical overview and saw how it's been used in different ways throughout the church. We talked about some of the schools of apologetics today and how they're utilized. This week, however, we're going to focus more on philosophy of religion. In particular, what we're going to do is we're going to examine competing worldviews so that in the following weeks, we can show that Christianity is actually a better alternative. So we're going to talk about philosophy, we're going to talk about religion, we're going to talk about worldview, and then we're going to go through some of the prominent worldviews and belief systems, show why I think they are irrational, and then that will sort of clear the floor. It sort of clears all other options so that we can say all other worldviews are not viable choices, and that leaves us free to then go ahead and defend Christianity throughout the rest of the class. So let's start by asking, what is philosophy? Philosophy comes from two different Greek words, philo, which means love, and sophia, which means wisdom. You probably already know that in the Greek language, there were multiple words for love. You've got agape, which is the sacrificial love that Jesus told us to have for each other. You've got the eros love, which is the erotic, romantic love. But then you've got this philo or phileo love, which means brotherly love. So there is to be this affectionate love for wisdom. Philosophy is an attempt to think through the questions we all ask. And these are kind of the big picture questions of life. These are things that humans have always wondered about, such as, why am I here? What is life all about? What is good? What is true? What is beautiful? Philosophy is basically the study of knowledge, existence, and reality itself. We might even say that philosophy is the study of the big questions in life. And asking these big questions, these are things that it's not just you and I that do this. You go back to the beginning of human history, and we have always marveled at these things. From the earliest humans, even to a child today who constantly asks questions. If you have children, you know you will constantly be bombarded with questions. What is this? How does this work? And one of the most common questions you hear is, why? Why? And then you give them an answer, and they ask a why to the answer. And then there's a why to that. And you just keep going and going and going. And this asking of questions of why, what is the meaning, what is the purpose, these types of things. This is one of the things that sets us apart as unique from animals. Because think about how animals go throughout their day primarily preoccupied with survival. Right? Animals are preoccupied with getting their food, with finding a mate, with finding shelter. They don't stop and gaze up at the stars and wonder, where did I come from? And what is the meaning of life? Humans, however, do exactly that. Animals don't pay attention to values, to purpose, or to beauty. Animals, might create something that looks beautiful, but they don't stop and marvel at it. We are the only creatures that build things just for beauty's sake. It doesn't just serve some sort of practical purpose for survival. There is no transcendent quality that dictates the choices of animals, but these have always been true of humans. So we might even say that philosophy has existed as long as humanity has existed, because we've always asked these why questions. When you hear philosophy, you probably think of it most prominently associated with Greek philosophy. The Greeks were not the first to do philosophy, but they most famously sort of systemized it, and those Greek views are still very much impacting society today. Kind of the grandfather of philosophy as we think of it was a man named Socrates. Socrates lived towards the end of the 5th century BC, and he introduced the famous Socratic method, or we might also call it the toddler method. And it is that why? So it would be like if I asked you, what did you do this weekend? Oh, I went kayaking. Why? Well, because I wanted to get a break. Why? Well, because I wanted to get out where nature was beautiful. Why? Why? I like nature. Why? And you just keep going and going. And the reason why Socrates did this, he wasn't just trying to be obnoxious. It's because he wanted to get people out of just their day-to-day routines and try to climb up the ladder of meaning. And if you ask enough why questions, you can get to that transcendent ultimate meaning that gives shape to everything else. At the end of the day, why do you do what you do? What is the transcendent reason why we make all these little everyday choices? And for that, Socrates was considered a nuisance because he was bothering people's I'm just trying to go about my business, man. I just want to eat lunch. And you're getting into epistemology and, what is the essence of the lunch and all this kind of stuff. And Socrates actually ended up being found guilty as a disturber of the peace, and they had him drink poison to kill himself. Because if you're a parent, sometimes with toddlers, you feel like, I understand why they got so upset with Socrates. But those why questions are so important. And I think it's good. In all seriousness, I think we should encourage kids to ask those questions because we ask the same questions that we all wonder about. Now, this raises a question. Should Christians do philosophy? Sometimes you hear it said maybe we shouldn't because supposedly philosophy is just a worldly system of human knowledge that undermines the authority of the Bible. And one of the verses you might have heard thrown around before is found in Colossians 2, verse 8. It says, "See to it that no one takes you captive by philosophy and empty deceit according to human tradition, according to the elemental spirits of the world, and not according to Christ." Now, I don't think this verse is prohibiting Christians from doing theology. And there's 3 reasons why that I list there. First of all, this verse is dealing specifically with philosophical systems that it says are based on empty deceit, human tradition, and the elemental spirits of the world. So it is not discounting the category of thinking through things altogether. It's warning you about bad systems of thought, about false systems of thought. Secondly, it warns about being taken captive by false systems. That means it's not prohibiting Christians from thinking through systems of thought. It warns us about being enslaved by false ones. And thirdly, if philosophy means seeking to understand reality better by asking questions and thinking through true and false systems, then Paul would have been a hypocrite, because Paul frequently employed the use of logic and reason in order to direct people to what is ultimately true. He was well read in the Greek philosophers, and we talked last week how in Acts 17, when he was debating with the Greek philosophers in Athens, he actually quoted some of their own poets to undermine their own belief system. He commanded Christians in Romans 12 to be transformed by the renewing of your mind. That's important. He doesn't say be transformed by shutting off your mind, but by using it properly. So if philosophy is done well, then it can be a very valuable tool for Christians to help us discern truth from error. And ultimately, it can help us think God's thoughts after him. If God is the source of all reason and rationality, and I believe that he is, then doing philosophy well is actually thinking God's thoughts after him and can actually help us be better in accord with the God of all truth. Now, what is the relationship between philosophy and religion? We're about to start talking about religion in just a moment. How do these two connect? Well, philosophy and religion really deal with many of the same questions if you think about it. Philosophy asks those why questions. Where did I come from? Why am I here? Where am I going? What ultimately matters? Well, religion provides an answer to those questions. Religion is a set of beliefs and practices that seeks to answer those. And so we might define the relationship between philosophy and religion as a philosophy of religion is thinking about faith. Philosophy of religion is thinking about faith. It takes the tools of philosophy, which use reason and logic, and it applies that to religion. Now, there are many different ways that you can study religion. You might study religion from a theological perspective, right? What is the theology of this particular faith system? You could study religion from a historical perspective. How have these different groups practiced religion? How have their beliefs and practices been shaped over time? You could study it from a sociological perspective. What does religion look like in this social group, and how does the social group contribute to the functioning of the religion? You could look at it from a psychological perspective. What's going on in the minds of people when they engage in religion? But philosophy of religion is a very particular branch of studying religion, and it is concerned with the reasonableness of religion. Is religion reasonable? And that's what philosophy of religion seeks to answer. And so in this lecture, we are going to use our reason to critically assess various religions and worldview. And throughout the rest of this class, throughout the rest of the overall class, we're going to then defend the validity of the Christian faith. So tonight is going to be examining worldview and these other systems of thought. And then, like I said, we're going to try to clear the floor of them to show that when we examine them using the tools of philosophy, they don't hold up. And that will then free us to then defend the validity of the Christian faith in particular. So let's go ahead and turn to the next page and we'll talk about religion. What is religion? Well, this can be a bit of a challenging discussion because there's no universally agreed upon definition of religion. Does it require belief in the supernatural? Can you reduce religion to just the habits and customs that people go through? Now, we might immediately from the get-go assume religion involves faith in God. The only problem with that is that not all religions profess faith in a divine being. So, for example, Buddhism, Taoism, and Jainism are universally recognized as official religions, and yet many of these branches do not profess faith in any sort of divine being. There's also many modern atheistic Hindus and Jews who participate in the cultic practices of their people. They go through these routines, they engage in these religious systems, but they are atheistic. They don't actually believe in God. So we can't limit religion to a system that believes in God. So what is religion then? Winfried Corden, he wrote a book on religion, world religions, and he offers, I think, a very helpful definition. He says, a religion is a system of beliefs and practices that by means of its cultus, and cultus means external rites, holy ceremonies, that sort of thing. A religion is a system of beliefs and practices that by means of its cultus directs a person towards transcendence and thus provides meaning and coherence to a person's life. And if we keep this definition in mind, I think we can say that somebody is religious even if they do not adhere to a particular religion. People have a religious instinct that they flex in many ways. Maybe they don't belong to a particular organized religion, but they are religious. And I think we can see that through a couple other definitions. Paul Tillich, for example, he's an existentialist philosopher. I don't agree with a lot of his philosophy, but here's his quote on what religion is. Religion is the state of being grasped by an ultimate concern, a concern which qualifies all other concerns as preliminary and which itself contains the answer to the question of the meaning of our life. There's another one, look further down, James C. Livingston. He's a professor of religion. He says, religion is that system of activities and beliefs directed toward and in response to that which is perceived to be of sacred value and transforming power. So really, at the end of the day, religion is sort of what you believe about ultimate reality and then how you live in light of that reality. What do you believe about ultimate reality? How do you live in light of that reality? And on those grounds, we could say that even something like materialistic atheism could be considered religious. We maybe wouldn't call it a religion, but it's certainly religious because it has beliefs about ultimate reality and then makes moral claims about how we should live based on that reality. Winfried Corden, again, says that to qualify as religious, it must be directed towards something that is transcendent. Now, what does transcendent mean? Transcendent means above and beyond, and it does not always necessarily refer to God. Rather, something that is transcendent is something that goes above and beyond our normal experiences. So the question, what is ultimately true about reality? Again, transcendence can include reference to a divine being, but it could also refer to non-theistic principles like survival of the fittest, or something for the greatest good. That's a transcendent principle because it says that is the ultimate thing that sort of gives shape to all reality. And then I order my life in light of that thing that gives shape to everything else. So while not all systems may be considered religions, they certainly can be considered religious. And I want to tease that out for a moment because that may not sit right with some of you. So let's go on to subpoint B and talk about religious instinct. Here's why I think any sort of ultimate belief system that then dictates how you live is religious in nature. And that's because religion is an inescapable instinct. I don't think humankind can escape from religion. And that's true throughout all of human history. You go to every civilization and every culture in every corner of the globe, even tribes and groups that have never had contact with the other, you will always find religion as a normative part of the human experience. Even atheists and skeptics, I think, can't avoid our religious instinct. There was a great article by a guy named Michael Crichton some years ago. Michael Crichton was the author of Jurassic Park, a very brilliant man, very scientific, who then put that into his writings. Michael Crichton was not a Christian. He was a Darwinian. He may have been agnostic. I think he was an atheist, but he was at least agnostic, very Darwinian. But he wrote a great article talking about how you cannot eradicate religion from the human psyche. It's built into us. And I have a quote from the article there. He said, "I studied anthropology in college, and one of the things I learned was that certain human social structures always reappear. They can't be eliminated from society. One of those structures is religion." And he goes down at the end of the quote and says, "If you suppress it, religion in one form merely reemerges in another form. You cannot believe in God, but you still have to believe in something that gives meaning to your life and shapes your sense of the world. Such a belief is religious." Now, to give you some context, this was an article about environmentalism. And Michael Crichton was writing about how modern environmentalists actually resemble a religious group. Through their claims about reality, through the activities they would engage in. And his whole point here is saying that even modern secularists who only believe in a material world still go about things religiously. Because if you suppress it in one way, this instinct just pops up in another way. So again, not every person can be said to belong to a religion, but every person is religious, and that they all believe in something that ultimately matters and try to live in light of it. And I think, as Crichton points out, even non-theistic systems of thought participate in religious-like rites. I think when you read the news headlines today and you look at what's going on in our modern culture, you see, for as much as people say, "I'm not religious," a lot of people exhibit strong traits of religion. So I give you some examples. In our own day, we often treat scientists as though they were priests. They're the enlightened ones who mediate their special knowledge about ultimate reality to the people. The scientist in his lab is sort of the sage on the mountaintop who gets words from the deity and then brings these special messages about truth back to the people. Social justice warriors and activists are the evangelists, publicly proclaiming their belief system, calling others to convert. The privileged folks must renounce their privilege and fragility as a form of repentance, and you must do penance for those things. Protesters and voters participate in the sacraments. These are holy acts you engage in by protesting or by going to the polls. Getting canceled is a form of excommunication. So these are just a few examples that show, while not every system is technically a religion, it exhibits all the impulses and practices that often mark religiosity. And I think that's inescapable. So now we go to the next page and we ask, well, why are we religious? Now, if asking the question, what is religion, was hard to find a definition on, the question, why are we religious, is even harder. And it's hard to do so because you can't answer that question without bringing a presupposition to the table. We talked last week about what a presupposition is. A presupposition is something you presuppose. It's an assumption you bring to the table, and that assumption informs the way you answer certain questions. So, if you were to ask the question, why are we religious, your presuppositions about religion and God will inform your answer. What do I mean by that? Well, think about the materialist. A materialist is somebody who just believes in a closed system of material matter. There's nothing spiritual or supernatural. It's just all matter in motion. If you were to ask them, why are we religious? They would say that it is our attempt to avoid our inevitable mortality. We are just creatures heading to the grave, and we want an escape, so we made up this idea of kind of a castle in the sky to help us escape from our own mortality. Or maybe we have this sense of guilt that we can't do anything about, so we make up religious practices that help us feel better about our own conviction. Or maybe they would say it was man in his pre-scientific state trying to make sense of the world. He hears thunder and he doesn't understand science, so he just ascribes it to some god up in the heavens. If you're a Marxist, you will say that religion is the opium of the masses. That's what Karl Marx taught about religion. Karl Marx taught that history was all about the oppressors and the oppressees, and that the people who were being oppressed made up religion to help comfort themselves because life was so terrible from the oppressors. And Marx thought that once you had equal distribution of wealth and everybody was even, the need for religion would go away. You didn't have to eradicate religion by force. It would go away all on its own because nobody would need God, because nobody would be oppressed anymore. If you're a pantheist, which we'll talk about in a little bit, you might say that we're all religious because all of us are pieces of God. And so we're really just sort of channeling our inner godhood, our participation in the divine. In each of these examples, you see how what you presuppose about truth informs how you answer this question. Why are we religious? Now, I'm going to give you an answer from a Christian perspective. I'm bringing my Christian presuppositions to the table. And hopefully by the end of the class, we'll see we have very good reasons for having Christian presuppositions. According to Christianity, we are religious because we were made in God's image, and we were designed to have a relationship with him. We possess what John Calvin called a sensus divinitas. It's an intrinsic inner sense of the divine. This has sometimes been called, it doesn't sound as cool as sensus divinitas, but it's the same basic idea of a God-shaped whole. This is part of our human identity that from the beginning was only ever intended to be fulfilled by the one true God. The one true God is whom we were meant to know and love. We have this instinct, this hole in our hearts, this sensus divinitas, in which was designed to be fulfilled by God. Just as we were designed to eat, and therefore your stomach starts rumbling about dinner time, just as we're designed to sleep, and so it gets too late in the evening, your eyelids start drooping, and just as we were designed for love, therefore you feel the sense of loneliness when you're apart from somebody, so we are designed for God, and therefore we are religious. I would argue that religion is not built by man, but rather it is built into man. There's a big difference there. Religion is not built by man, it is built into man. And so we have an intrinsic sense of and desire for the designer. Now, C.S. Lewis put this very beautifully in Mere Christianity. He said, creatures are not born with desires unless satisfaction for those desires exists. A baby feels hunger. Well, there's such a thing as food. A duckling wants to swim. Well, there's such a thing as water. Men feel sexual desire. Well, there's such a thing as sex. If I find in myself a desire which no experience in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world. If none of my earthly pleasures satisfy it, that does not prove that the universe is a fraud. Probably earthly pleasures were never meant to satisfy it, but only to arouse it, to suggest the real thing. Why do we have religious desires? Because there really is an answer to that religious impulse. We have to find out, though, what is the right answer to that impulse. That's what we want to seek. So now the other question is, why are there so many religions? And again, I'm going to answer from the Christian perspective. The presence of sin means we experience relational separation from God. We have turned away from the one true God. But here's the thing, that turning away does not mean that the religious instinct in us goes away. That God-shaped hole isn't filled just because we pretend that God isn't there anymore. Rather, it's as strong as ever because it's not being satisfied. But since we've rejected God and we won't have that sensus divinitas filled by him, we seek to fill that hole in many other ways. So here's an example I give. Suppose there was a group of men and they decided to no longer eat food. Would their decision to no longer eat food make the sense of hunger go away? No, not at all. In fact, it would probably become more intense. So what do they do to satisfy those hunger pains? Well, they begin eating clothes from their closet, or they begin tearing pages out of their book, or maybe they begin eating cardboard boxes from the garage. Now, their refusal of food did not mean that their hunger went away. It only meant that they sought to fulfill that hunger elsewhere. But of course, eating clothes and cardboard and paper, it might make the hunger pains go away temporarily, but it's ultimately not what your body needs. And so will ultimately end up being disastrous for you. It might temporarily alleviate hunger pains, but it'll ultimately kill you. And I think the same thing is true of religion. Man's religious impulse did not disappear because we turned away from God. But since we turned away from God, we sought to fill that hole with all sorts of other things. We sought to fill that hunger with a variety of substitutes. And these imitations may temporarily curb our religious longings, but they cannot deliver what we ultimately need. So the solution, we need to understand, is not to eat household objects. That is, not just any religion will do, nor is it to eliminate the category of hunger altogether and say, well, the heck with it then, no religion at all. What is the solution? Go back to eating food. We must go back to the food that we were originally meant for, which is true religion. Now, which religion is the true one? We're going to talk about that in a little bit here. Let's talk about religion and worldview. Because at this point, we're going to introduce worldview because this is very important. That although not every belief system qualifies as a religion, we have observed that every belief system is religious in nature. Everybody has a set of beliefs about ultimate reality, how we should live in light of that reality. And another name for this religious instinct, this religious way of looking at the world, is what's called a worldview. So while not everybody has a religion, everybody has a worldview. In fact, I would call a worldview sort of the religious impulse of every person. The religious way we look at the world and try to make sense of the world is our worldview. So let's go on to point number 3 here and talk about what is a worldview. A worldview in its most basic form is how we see reality. A worldview is the lens through which we observe the world and the way that we interpret the significance of all that happens in the world. It gives shape to the way we see life, it informs the way we interpret life, and it provides the road on which we walk through life. If you are either a part of the youth group here or you go to DCA, you've heard me talk about worldview before, and I've often compared it to a set of glasses, right? So the glasses you're wearing shape the way you see what's in front of you. If I'm wearing glasses that are tinted green, then when I look at the room, everything I see is in green. That's what happened in the book The Wizard of Oz. I was very disappointed as a kid because if you watch the Wizard of Oz movie, you know the Emerald City is green, everything's green. And then you read the book and you find out, oh no, actually it wasn't. They just wore green glasses. And so everything you look at in the city looks green because they had green tinted glasses. Well, our worldview is kind of the same way. It's the lens through which you see everything, and everything is colored and interpreted because of the lens you are wearing. Let me give you an example of how a worldview works. Let's suppose that me and Trina take one of our kids to the library for a magic show. And we'll just say one kid, right? Not because we love one kid more than the other, because it's the only way this analogy is going to work. So let's say me and Trina take one of our kids to go see a magic show at the library. The 3 of us sit down in the same building. We watch the same person doing the same events. But all 3 of us have different beliefs about what's happening here. Perhaps our child believes that magic is real. And so when they see the magician pull a rabbit out of a hat or guess which card they pulled out of the deck, they think, wow, real magic is happening right in front of me. And they're in awe. Perhaps Trina does not believe that magic is real, but she believes this is a very kind-hearted man who's really good at sleight of hand tricks. So she watches the same events as our kid, but she interprets it very differently. I, meanwhile, am convinced that this magician is a con man and a fraud who's trying to swindle the children and the families out of something. And so I'm watching the same thing, but I'm watching him with extreme skepticism because I'm just waiting for him to like pick somebody's pocket or like make a kid cry or something like that. So all 3 of us are watching this, again, the same person in the same location do the same thing. But we all have different worldviews about what's going on. And so we interpret the same event differently. Well, the same is true of our world. Humans share the same world. We see the same things happening. We can observe the same human nature. We can observe the same cycles of nature. We can read the same history book. But our worldview shapes how we interpret those events. That's how you might have a Buddhist and a Roman Catholic watching a sunset, and they see the same sun, the same shade, doing the same thing, and they arrive at radically different conclusions about what's happening because they have a worldview, a presupposition that informs how they interpret it. So that lens leads you to interpret the data differently. A worldview is the perspective we take in order to answer those big questions in life we talked about earlier. Philosophy raises those big questions. Religion provides the answer to those big questions. And then the worldview is sort of the filter or the perspective we take, and we interpret life in light of how those big questions are answered. So I like to think of a worldview as primarily asking 10 questions. Now, not everybody agrees on this. Some people will say a worldview is ultimately 3 questions, 5 questions, 7 questions. I started making this list a few years ago, and I think I started with 4, and now I'm up to 10. So who knows, maybe we'll add more. But I think a worldview can kind of come down to these 10 basic questions. That of our origin. Where did I come from? Reality. What is the structure of existence? Identity. Who am I? Meaning. Why am I here? Authority. Who's in charge? Knowledge. How do I know what's true? Morality. How should I live? Conflict. What's wrong with the world? Resolution. What is the solution to what's wrong in the world? And destiny. Where am I going? How you answer these questions is your worldview. Now, we've already argued that although not everybody belongs to a religion, everyone has a religious impulse. And I think that religious impulse is expressed in our worldview. And so we may call a worldview someone's inescapably religious outlook of the world. It's the way that we see all that happens, and that goes through the filter of our beliefs about ultimate reality. Okay, with that established, we're going to go on to point number 4, and then we'll take our break. Point number 4, we're going to now discuss how do we know which religion or worldview is the correct one? Are any of them correct? Are all of them correct? Are all of them wrong? Are some of them partly right? Are some of them mostly right? So we're going to examine some criteria that we can use when critically assessing religions and worldview. And I'm going to suggest 3 criteria we can use. When we take a worldview, turn it over in our hands, examine it, we can ask these 3 types of questions to determine whether or not it's a valid worldview. The first thing we want to consider, though, is all truth claims require faith. So before I go any further, we need to understand this. All truth claims require faith. Now, there's often this perception that if you have faith, you don't need to think, or that if you're a thinking person, you don't use faith. Well, as it turns out, the two actually go hand in hand. There's this assumption very often that if you have evidence, that means it is absolute, seal tight, beyond all shadow of a doubt certainty. If you have evidence for something, you don't need faith because it is locked in, absolute, guaranteed proof. And so the thinking person who uses evidence thinks they don't need belief or faith because evidence provides me with all the certainty that I need. But I'm going to make a proposal here. If evidence means sealed, tight, no room for error, you know it with absolute certainty, no possible chance you could be wrong, then we could never be sure about anything. Everybody uses faith to have even basic assumptions about your own life. Even your most basic assumptions about the reality in front of you requires faith of some kind. Think about it this way. How can you be absolutely sure you're not plugged into the matrix right now? Can you prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that aliens or a big giant supercomputer doesn't have you plugged into an artificial reality right now? You might be real, but what if all of this is a simulation? What if I'm not real? What if I'm a hologram? You have no absolute way of proving it, do you? You have very good reason to think that's not the case, but you can't prove it beyond a reason of a shadow, what's the expression? Shadow of a doubt. Thank you so much. Or how can you prove maybe that your spouse isn't an undercover secret agent? Can any of you prove that? I mean, you might think, I know everything that they do. I do all their laundry. I'm with them all the time. They're a really good secret agent. They're deep undercover. Can you prove it beyond a shadow of a doubt? Or what about when it comes to things like science and rationality? Science and rationality depends on using our faculties of thought and experimentation and our senses to arrive at conclusions. Rational thought requires us to use our minds to think logically. Well, how do we know that our senses are accurately perceiving things? The scientist who does experiments in the lab, how does he know that his senses are working properly? How do we know that our brains are accurately processing things? You know, the funny thing about a crazy person is they don't know they're crazy. They think their faculties are working perfectly fine. How do we know that our senses and our brains are working properly? It requires a bit of faith, doesn't it? So at the end of the day, there are very few, I would argue, if any things we can know with a locked degree of certainty, where you say it is absolute certainty. I would argue that everything requires faith of some kind. What accounts for most everyday experiences, including our ultimate beliefs, it is believing that something is true based upon reasonable cause for doing so. I would argue that's what we mean when we say we know something. We believe something is true based upon reasonable cause for doing so. In other words, we have faith. Now, a lot of people might not like this. A non-religious person will say, I don't have faith. In fact, I watched a great debate the other day. It was between a Christian and I believe he was an atheist, but they were arguing about faith. And the Christian apologist said, everybody has faith. And he said, you have faith, in fact. You've made these observations, and based on what you've observed, you believe such and such. And the atheist said, I don't have faith, I have confidence. He said there's a big difference between those two. I don't have faith, I have confidence. I've examined the data and I'm confident that it's true. And the apologist simply responded by digging into the roots of the word confidence. He said confidence is made up of two Latin words, con, meaning with, and fide, meaning faith. Confidence means with faith. You hold this as true because you have faith that it is true. And the atheist was kind of silenced about it. So faith at the end of the day is unavoidable. The non-religious person who wraps up all their confidence in science, observation, and logic alone has to have faith that those are valuable vehicles of truth. It's unavoidable for the skeptic who says we can't trust anything. The skeptic says we can't have faith in anything. But the one thing that the skeptic has faith in is in their own observations that nothing is worth putting faith in. Every worldview requires some degree of faith. The only question is it reasonable faith? So now we're going to ask, what type of three criteria might we use to say, does something, is it reasonable faith? And here's the three criteria. First, that of livable conclusions. What do I mean by livable conclusions? I mean, would the consequences of this system contradict other conclusions we already hold to be true? So let's say there's something you believe beyond a shadow of a doubt is true. It's something that you've experienced in the world. You know that it's true. Now you start to embrace this worldview, but the conclusions of the worldview contradict what you already know to be true of the world. Do the claims of this worldview make proper sense of what you know to be true in the world? And if I lose you on these, that's okay, because we're going to see them fleshed out. We're going to apply these criteria to actual worldviews, and you'll see what I mean by these. So, livable conclusions. Would the consequences of this system contradict other conclusions I already hold and know to be true? Second criteria, internal consistency. Are there contradictions within the worldview itself? Does a part of the system depend on something that would be inconsistent with other claims made by the system? Does the system depend on assumptions that don't arise naturally from that worldview, but is actually borrowed from another worldview? So the first criteria looks for external contradictions. Does this new worldview that I'm flirting with, does it interfere with external conclusions I already have? This second criteria looks for internal contradictions. Does the worldview that I have, does it contradict itself? And then the third one is lines of evidence. Is there any way this worldview can be proof tested? Are its claims consistent with the laws of logic and the law of non-contradiction? Can any sort of scientific proof, historical eyewitness testimony, documentation, archaeology, or maybe any other extraordinary evidence? Are there miracles accompanying this, fulfilled prophecy, that sort of thing? Is there any other line of evidence that can support this claim? So we want to make sure that it has a livable conclusion. Can I live in such a world in which this worldview is true? Secondly, is it consistent with itself, or does it need to borrow from other worldviews? And thirdly, are there any other lines of evidence that might support its truth? And I would argue that a credible worldview and a credible system of faith, whether secular or religious in nature, should be able to meet these three criteria. I would argue that if one of these three criteria is not met, then it is unreasonable. And so we're going to go ahead and we're going to take our break. We'll break for about 10 minutes. And then when we come back, we're going to spend the rest of the time examining some of the major worldviews and religions and applying these three criteria to see if they're reasonable. All right, section 5. This will be the last major section we cover tonight. Examination of major worldviews and religion. Now, before we do so, there's a very important thing we need to, I think, lay down first. This is true of this section, and it's going to be true of the entire course. And that is that whenever we are discussing other worldviews or religious systems, we want to strive for accuracy in describing what that system actually believes. It's really easy to take a cheap shot and exaggerate or misrepresent what a worldview teaches in order to take an easy, cheap shot at it. But we don't want to do that. We want to be faithful to be able to describe what they actually believe. And I just list 3 reasons for that. One, it fulfills the golden rule of Christ. Jesus said, treat others the way you want to be treated. If you get irritated when you see Christianity misrepresented in the media, which I think happens a lot, we want to show the same courtesy to our neighbors, even if we think they're wrong, and make sure we are accurately describing what they actually believe. 2, a person from that belief system will not be terribly open to us if we're disingenuous enough to distort their claims. If we are intentionally misrepresenting a religion or worldview to somebody saying, well, what you actually believe is this, they're not going to be terribly receptive to us. But thirdly, we will not have actually disproven their belief system at all. We will have committed a logical fallacy, which is called the straw man argument. You will have set up a straw man that is actually not what the person believes, and then you will have beat up that straw man and give yourself a pat on the back. That doesn't do anything. In the name of good apologetics, we want to actually deconstruct the actual belief system that somebody belongs to. So in the name of doing good apologetics, we want to make sure we represent them accurately. Now, what's going to be dealt with here are going to be extremely general summaries of these worldviews. You may find nuance among these things, and so I'm going to encourage you to do two things. First, do your own further research on some of these worldviews and belief systems. And two, when you're talking with a real human being, ask a lot of open-ended questions. You might assume, well, Mark had a 3-sentence summary of this worldview, and now I know everything this person believes about everything. In order to be fair to that person, ask a lot of questions. You might find that there might be nuance there that they don't actually agree with. So ask a lot of questions. All right, now let's do a worldview overview. We're going to look at two different types of worldviews. The first is going to be worldviews concerning God, and the next will be worldviews concerning knowledge and truth. The first worldview is that of theism. Theism comes from the Greek word theo, meaning God. So last week I referenced my son, whose middle name is Aquinas, named after Thomas Aquinas. This week I will reference him again because his first name is Theodore. Theodore means gift of God. And so I always feel a little irreverent when I call him Theo, because Theo is actually the Greek word for God. If I was speaking to a Greek-speaking person and I referenced my son Theo, they might think I was committing blasphemy. Theism is the belief that there is at least one God, and this God is personal and involved in the world. That's theism. There is a personal God who is involved in the world. But then there's a couple distinctions of theism, and one of those is monotheism. So we already know the word theism, that refers to God. Now we have the introduction of this prefix mono. Mono means one. There is only one God, and there are three major monotheistic religions, and that is Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Now, there's a couple important distinctions between those. In Judaism and in Islam, they do not believe that God is a trinity. In Islam, it goes even further, because in Islam, it is believed that the Jewish and Christian Bibles have actually been incredibly distorted and corrupted over the years, and that Muhammad was the true and final prophet of God, or Allah as they call him. Salvation then in Islam is achieved by adhering to the 5 pillars of Islam, and that is a profession of faith in Allah, prayer, the giving of alms, fasting, and at least one point in your life, you're supposed to make a pilgrimage over to what they consider the holy city of Mecca. Monotheism, the belief in one God. Then there's polytheism. Poly means many. And so polytheism says there are multiple gods. It could be 2, it could be 2 million. Either way, if you believe in more than one deity, you are a polytheist. There's also animism. Now we're going to switch from the Greek language to the Latin language. It's from the Latin word anima, meaning life or soul. If you say somebody is a very animated character, they have a lot of life and sort of spirit in them. That's anima. Animism believes that all things, whether it's living or non-living, so it could be you, could be a squirrel, could be a rock, all things living and non-living possess distinct spirits. Now, this is a little bit different than polytheism, because they will not necessarily say these spirits are gods. They are just these spirit beings that sort of indwell every single physical object. There is not an object that exists that does not have some sort of spirit in it or working behind it. Then there's pantheism. This is a fun one. Pantheism comes from the Greek word pan, meaning all. The idea of pantheism, all God, is that God is all and all is God. God is not a personal being. Rather, God is the force that is everything. So pantheism would say that I am a part of God, you are a part of God, the plants are a part of God. Everything is a piece of God, and their word for God is Brahman. Now, there's 2 different versions of pantheism that I want to distinguish. The first is the pantheism that's seen in the Hindu religion. In the Hindu version of pantheism, our life is bad because what you're experiencing right now is just an illusion. You and I are actually pieces of the one Brahman, who again is not a person or a personal being. It's just sort of this all-pervading force. You and I are pieces of Brahman. And what's bad is that we are experiencing reality as individuals. The fact that you are experiencing reality right now as an individual is a bad thing, because you are not experiencing the unity as Brahman that you should. So our goal is to get rid of our individualism, our individuality, and re-merge back with Brahman. And this is done through living many lifetimes, a series called Reincarnation. You die, but your true self, the soul, the piece of Brahman, comes back in another body. And you go through this cycle of reincarnation, earning either good karma or bad karma. If you have bad karma, you come back as a lower life form. If you have good karma, you move a little higher up the ladder. And eventually, you move so high up the ladder that the cycle of death and rebirth stops, and you rejoin with Brahman. And the analogy that's used of this rejoining with Brahman, it's a process called moksha. Moksha is like achieving the ultimate goal of your existence, and that is to rejoin with Brahman, and it's described as like a drop going back into the ocean. Well, what happens when you put a drop in the ocean? Does it retain its individual dropness? No, it loses its individual properties and just sort of remerges back into the water. And Hinduism would say that is our ultimate goal, to achieve moksha. Your individuality, the individual experience you have right now, is an illusion, and it's bad. You need to break out of this illusion and disappear back into the ocean of Brahman. There's also the Buddhist version of Hinduism. Buddha was actually a Hindu prince who was not satisfied with Hinduism, and so he kind of invented his own version of it. In Buddhism, our life is also an illusion, but the reason why life is an illusion is because nothing is real at all. All reality is actually false. There is no such thing as the self, and there is no such thing as reality. Our whole life is an illusion because nothing really exists. Everything is ultimately nothingness. And so the biggest problem we have is that we experience desire. Buddha means the enlightened one. And this enlightenment he had was that all problems in the world are caused by desire. Why do people starve? Because their bodies desire food and they can't get it. Why do people feel lonely? Because they desire love and they can't have it. Why do we dread death? Because we desire life and we can't have it. And so Buddha's conclusion was that desire is the problem. And so he also believed in the series of reincarnation. You have good karma, bad karma. With enough good karma, you can move up the line and you can achieve what's called not moksha, but nirvana. Now, what is nirvana? Nirvana just means nothingness. It means oblivion. Nirvana just means, it means becoming extinguished. And so the ultimate goal of Buddhism is to realize nothing is real and you actually are extinguished and cease to exist, because you actually don't exist right now. You're just imagining that you exist. And you need to break out of this illusion and be consistent with that non-existent reality. So you can stop the cycle of death and suffering through this process of reincarnation, and ultimately you achieve the state of nothingness, and in nothingness you're free of all desire. All right, that's pantheism. Panentheism is very similar. That also has that word pan, meaning all, but there's another Greek word in there, en, which means in. So this doesn't say that everything is God, but rather it says everything is in God and God is in everything. So it would make a distinction between God and the physical order of things, but it says they're bound up together, almost like a woman carrying a child within her. Right? The world is sort of within God, but then God is also sort of within the world. And so both are growing together. As the world is growing and developing, God is also growing and developing. And as God grows and develops, the world grows and develops with him. Panentheism is an attempted middle ground between theism on one hand, pantheism on the other. Another view about God is called deism. Deism comes from the Latin word for God, deus or deo. You know, when we sing in excelsis Deo, that's glory to God in the highest. Deism also means God, but it says there is a God who created everything. It acknowledges there's a creator, but the belief is that this creator God left everything to run on its own sort of mechanistic system. God put these scientific laws in place and now leaves the universe to run on that, and he doesn't interfere. It's compared to a watch, right? If somebody makes a watch, they wind it up and then they leave it and they let it tick and run all on its own. That's God in the deist worldview. He makes everything, sets these mechanical laws in place, and now he's hands off. He doesn't actively uphold the universe, and he certainly doesn't get involved in the universe. That's why the deist would not believe in miracles, and the deist would not believe in the revelation given in the Bible, because they say God does not enter into the world or interact with the world in any kind of way. Then there's agnosticism. Agnosticism takes the Greek word gnosis, which means knowledge, and it slaps an A prefix at the beginning. A in the Greek means no or not. So an agnostic, it means no knowledge. And that means we cannot be sure if there is a God. An agnostic will not say for sure there is a God or there is not a God. An agnostic will just say we have no way of knowing either way. And then there is atheism. Atheism takes that prefix A and slaps it onto theism. So while theism means belief in God, atheism means no God. All right, so these are some of the major worldviews on God. Now let's look at some worldviews concerning knowledge and truth. First is materialism. Materialism is the belief that reality is all that exists. There's no spiritual, there's no supernatural. Matter is all there is. If something can't be found in the physical universe, it doesn't exist. Then there's scientism. Scientism says that the scientific method is the only, or at least the best way to obtain truth. If something cannot be proven through the scientific method, it should not be believed. Rationalism says that human reason is the chief and most secure source of obtaining true knowledge. Reason is our most secure way of knowing anything. Postmodernism says genuine knowledge cannot be known at all. All truth claims are relative. And if you try to claim absolute truth about anything, that is simply a grab for power. Pluralism says there are multiple paths to God because any number of beliefs about God can actually be true. So your view on God might be correct, and this other person's view about God may be correct. In fact, both could be true. And the popular allegory you hear to describe pluralism is the story of the 5 blind men who encounter an elephant. Maybe you've heard this before. The idea is that there's 5 blind men who all walk up to an elephant and all reach out and feel up this elephant. And one of the blind men feels the trunk and says, this is long and an elephant is long and snake-like. That's what an elephant is. The other blind man feels the tail and says, no, an elephant is short and kind of hairy at the end. The third blind man puts his arms around one of the elephant's legs and says, you guys are both wrong. The elephant's legs, the elephant is like a tree trunk. That's what an elephant is. The other feels the elephant's tusks and says, I got all you guys beat. You're all wrong. I've got a corner on truth. The elephant is actually this hard, sort of rock-like substance. And then the final guy feels the side of the elephant and says, no, the elephant is like a wall. All 5 of these guys claim this is what the elephant is, when in reality, they all have limited perspectives. And if you back up and look at the whole picture, they all just have a corner of the elephant. And so the pluralist will say that's what world religions are. All religions maybe get a part of God right, but in the end, you back up and you see that God is actually all of these things sort of combined into one. The moral relativist says objective morality does not exist. All morality is it's a product of particular cultures at particular times. All right and wrong is simply relative. Existentialism says there is no God before whom we're accountable. There is no God who has set a purpose or meaning for our life. We are totally free and autonomous beings, and that means we get to create our own meaning. We get to create our own purpose. We get to find our own significance. Humanism says, we should stop caring about all this God stuff. Our main focus ought to be on humans. Humans have a good moral nature. People are basically good. We're capable of doing great things. We have intrinsic value, and we ought to honor the value of humans through this emphasis on human rights. We should care about people's well-being. We should care about prosperity in the world. Our focus should be on human affairs. Stop caring about divinity, about heaven, about spiritual stuff. We don't need a God to ransom us from sin. We don't need a divine point of reference for anything. We don't need to live for an afterlife. Our main concern ought to be humanity. hence the term humanism. And then lastly, there's skepticism. Skepticism says we can never really know about anything with any degree of certainty. Everything should be questioned. Just question everything. Be a skeptic about absolutely any truth claims that are put forward whatsoever. Okay, everybody doing okay? We got to catch our breath for a sec. That's a lot of worldviews to consider. Now, don't I'm not expecting you guys to like remember all these names, but I want you to think about these as like you read the newspaper or you watch television shows or you have conversations with people. You will very often find that people have one or more of these worldviews without even knowing that they do it. Again, everybody has a worldview. They may not always know the names for it, but as you talk to people, listen for these types of presuppositions to inform their conversation. Now, let's move on to a critique of these worldviews. We've explained what they are, but why should Christianity be a better option as opposed to these? Well, now we're going to work on trying to critique these a little bit using those 3 criteria we talked about earlier. So let's start with Islam. The first criteria we talked about is livable conclusions. And what that means is, if you accept this worldview, here's the conclusion you have to live with. If you don't like this conclusion, then either you need to change what you believe or you need to get a new worldview. So in Islam, the livable conclusion is that human beings must be good enough to earn Allah's acceptance. Our eternal destiny is contingent on our ability to be good enough, and there will never be any assurance that you will go to heaven. If you want to accept Islam, you have to accept that worldview implication. But what about lines of evidence? Well, Muhammad never performed any public miracles. Muhammad never gave any prophecy that was ever validated in any sort of way. You will not find prophecy in the Quran that was ever validated. In fact, so not only, unlike Christianity, Islam can't provide validation through miracles. It can't provide validation through prophecy. It also contradicts straight-up history. The Quran claims that Jesus didn't actually die on the cross. And there are many even secular historians going back to the 1st and 2nd century who confirm, yeah, this guy Jesus of Nazareth was actually crucified by the Romans. So Islam, I think, has some tough livable conclusions, and I think it has some evidence that doesn't do it any favors. What about polytheism and animism? We won't spend too much time on these because I don't think this is a problem for a lot of people in our context. But basically, I think they both suffer from the same flaw. They can't account for the unified order of the universe. In polytheism, different gods control different realms of nature. These gods are always warring with each other. That sets the natural order kind of at odds with itself, right? Nature is just this battlefield of warring forces. But I don't think that can give account for why the universe seems to run so smoothly. In polytheism and animism, the universe is too disjointed. But rather, when we look at the universe, I think we see one whole system whose parts are fitted nicely together. Polytheism can't account for that. What about pantheism? A couple livable conclusions you'd have to accept. If our greatest problem is experiencing individuality, and if our great goal is to re-merge with Brahman like a drop going back into the ocean, then there can be no such thing as love. Love is not an eternal reality because love requires at least 2 people involved. It involves someone doing the loving, and it involves someone being loved. If pantheism is true, then love does not exist because there are not ultimately 2. Everything is ultimately 1. Secondly, if everything and everyone is actually Brahman or God, then that means evil is just as much a part of God as good. Now, a Hindu will respond to this while saying, no, good and evil are categories outside of God. Well, now you've got 2 possible problems. One, according to the basic tenet of pantheism is that nothing is outside of God. Everything is God. So if good and evil are outside of God, now you've got something that is outside of God, and that contradicts your basic premise. So a pantheist will respond and will say, well, good and evil are just illusions. They can be outside God because they're not real, they're illusions. But I don't think any pantheist can consistently live this out. If a pantheist child dies, you weep over that child because you do not say, this grief is simply an illusion. The grief of losing someone is real. Pain and suffering are real, and the pantheist cannot consistently live out their own worldview. There's some problems with internal consistency. So let's look at the second one there. If Brahman and God, or God as they call him, Brahman, is beyond good and evil, then how can it be considered good to remerge with Brahman? If the whole goal is it's a good thing to remerge with Brahman, Well, if Brahman is outside of good and evil, then it's not a good thing to remerge with Brahman. Doesn't really make sense. Thirdly, if our individual experiences are simply illusions, then how do we know that the pantheistic claim divinity is not itself an illusion? If everything is just one big illusion, then maybe so is the claim that we're actually a part of Brahman. Maybe that itself is an illusion. All right, so those are some internal inconsistencies. But then there's lines of evidence that are deeply problematic. Pantheism claims that God and the universe are the same, and that God/universe have always existed. But modern science has proven that the universe had a starting point. The universe began at some point. So the scientific explanation would contradict the claims of pantheism, that the universe/God has always been. The Christian can say God has always been, but the universe has not, because the eternal, infinite God created the universe. Pantheism can't say that, and it's a problem. But secondly, pantheism's wild claims about Brahman, reincarnation, there's no way to test that. There's no empirical evidence you can point to, and there's no historical evidence you can point to. It's an untestable claim. It's metaphysical speculation, no way to test whether it's legitimate or not. So that's pantheism. What about the Buddhist version of pantheism? Well, something you'd have to live with is that life is ultimately pointless, because life is ultimately nothingness. So if you accept Buddhism, you have to live with that reality. You have to accept the idea that non-existence is better than existence. They would assume that to not exist is better than to exist at all. Also, they would say that the problem is not twisted or misplaced desire, but desire as a category is wrong. As Christians, we would say the problem is that our desires have been corrupt. The Buddhists would say, no, the problem is that you have desire at all. The problem is that would include good desire. That would mean that love is a bad thing. That would mean that pleasure is a bad thing, because any desire is wrong. We could look at some internal inconsistencies. Here's a big question. How can nothingness experience an illusion? It is nothing. It can't do anything. It can't experience anything, much less an illusion, because it doesn't exist. If there is no self or no soul, then who is the subject undergoing reincarnation? If it's just nothingness. But then there's lines of evidence, and like the Hindu version of pantheism, Buddhism makes these metaphysical claims that there's no way to test whatsoever. What about panentheism? Let's go on to that. Maybe we'll go through this one real quick. We got to make sure we leave time for some of these other ones here. Panentheism, basically because it claims that God is growing and developing with the universe, that would create several facts about God that some people might have a hard time with. That would mean that God is limited because the universe is limited in shape and size. That would mean that there's limits to God. The universe began to exist. It was caused by something. That would mean God had to have been caused by something. And since the universe is always changing and God is changing, that means God is not perfect. You say, how is that the case? Well, if something changes, it either becomes less than what it was before or greater than what it was before. If God becomes less than what he was before, then God is not perfect because he is now less than what he had been. But if God changes or gets better, then that means God was not perfect at the previous point before he got better. So if God changes, God is not perfect. So if you accept panentheism, then you would have to say God is limited, God was caused by something, and God is not perfect. The other lines of evidence about panentheism is that it is illogical, like we just pointed out. And like pantheism, panentheism makes these metaphysical claims can't be tested. All right, let's move on. We're getting down to the last 2 pages here. Now we're going to get into some stuff that I think we really face in our culture. There's the idea of deism. Deism, I think, has a tough, livable conclusion, because if deism is true, we ultimately as humans have no hope or purpose for redemption because God is just not concerned with us. We are totally on our own, and we are left to face reality as though God did not exist at all. There is no comfort in deism in saying there is a God, he just doesn't interact with our world. Because that means we basically face a reality that is as though God didn't exist. God doesn't care about us. God doesn't reach in to save us. God has no concern for what happens in our life. If deism is true, then there may be a God, but he's not a God worthy of worship, and he's not a God who cares about you. There's also some internal inconsistency there, because there are actually some deists who still believe in a soul or the afterlife. Deists will claim that you either go to eternal life or you experience damnation based on your moral conduct. The only problem is, if there is no God who makes himself known, how do we know what's right or wrong in the first place? How do we know what this God expects of us? And without a self-revealing God, On what basis can we claim evidence that there is eternal life or judgment? If God hasn't spoken and revealed there is an eternal judgment for the good and for the evil, then how do we know that that's the case? It's nothing more than raw speculation if God has not spoken. So the deist is resorted to wild speculation. Let's go on to agnosticism. I think we have a lot of people in our culture today who are agnostics. That means they're not willing to say there is no God, but they also can't quite get on board with there being a God either. And I think that an agnostic is actually faced with a very unlivable condition because the agnostic cannot consistently live out his claims. Why do I say that? Because the agnostic must either adopt functional atheism or functional religion. What do I mean by that? I mean, he must live either as though God exists or as though God does not exist. He may say he refuses to pass judgment. I don't believe and I don't disbelieve, but he must live as though one or the other were true. If he lives how he chooses and he says there's no transcendent moral standard that I'm accountable to, I don't live in fear of judgment, I don't live under anybody's authority, you are living as though you were an atheist. Whereas if you believe there is some transcendent good, and I try to live my life in light of that transcendent good, you are living as though religion is true. So an agnostic cannot live out his own beliefs consistently. He has to live as though he were an atheist or live as though God were real. He must cast a wager one way or the other. Now I'm going to group a couple together because these are similar. Atheism, materialism, and scientism. If these three are true, then here's some conclusions we have to be willing to accept. Good and evil are not real categories. Good and evil are ultimately a matter of personal preference. Human beings do not possess real objective value. We simply assign value to ourselves. Existence ultimately has no meaning or purpose. Nothing we do matters in the end because billions of years from now, when the universe just sort of implodes on itself, it'll be like we were never here in the first place. So none of the buildings we build, none of the advances we make, none of the progresses we make will ultimately matter. The universe will never even know that we were here. It all means nothing in the end. And then love is merely a survival mechanism. Is love really powerful? No, it's not. It's a survival mechanism designed exclusively to propagate the continuation of our species. That's it. What about internal consistency? The claim that all things can be known through the scientific method cannot be proven using the scientific method. That's important. The scientific method is using experimentation and the senses to arrive at conclusions. But the claim that the scientific method is the only surefire way to know anything, that claim cannot be proven using the scientific method. So we've got an inconsistency there. Many atheists are kind people. I've known some very gracious ones. They insist on showing love to all people groups. They insist on showing love to the sick, the vulnerable, the disabled. And yet, this conclusion cannot be arrived at using the premises of atheism. According to the Darwinian survival of the fittest, right, you want the strong ones in your species to pass on their genes. And what is ultimately of importance is the strength and survival of your species. In the animal kingdom, they don't have special care units for sick or disabled animals. They're left to die because they're going to slow down the whole species. So an atheist is in a contradiction with his own worldview. He believes that it's all about the survival of the fittest, but I also think it's important to show care to the least of these. You don't see that in the animal kingdom. In fact, that's going to hold up the rest of your species. Think about if you've got a family with 10 children. One of those children has extreme special needs. This children maybe needs to live on a breathing tube, requires around-the-clock medical care. Do you know how much time, energy, and resource you're going to spend on that one disabled member of the family? Do you know how much time you're taking away from the other children? Do you know how much of your income you're taking away from feeding those 9 healthy children and pouring into the one disabled child? In a Darwinian worldview, you need to get rid of that other person because they're holding back the rest of the group. And in fact, in the animal kingdom, that's what they do. But thankfully, no Darwinian will live out their own worldview because they recognize that survival of the fittest is not a tenable way to live with other human beings. But we also know if love is only good because it's a survival mechanism, then again, any collective love shown to the sick, the vulnerable, and the disabled will hurt the rest of the group. And therefore, showing love to the sick and the disabled in a purely Darwinian worldview would not be a good thing. It would hold back the advancement of our species. So I think we've got an inconsistency there. But then what about lines of evidence? Atheism is contingent upon, I think, 2 utterly irrational claims. The first is that existence emerged from non-existence. If there is no God, then there was nothing, and in the beginning, nothing exploded. It's an illogical statement. You cannot bring existence from non-existence. The other irrational point that atheism depends on is the emergence of life from non-life. There was this thing that was non-living, and that non-living thing became a living organism. There is absolutely nothing, according to the scientific method's own standards of knowledge, that we have ever been able to observe existence coming from non-existence or something living coming from something that is non-living. The fine-tuning of the universe suggests design. That might be disputed, but as we'll see next week when we talk about the existence of God, this is actually one of the arguments that most atheists will say is the most powerful argument for God's existence. An atheist who studies the universe says it looks so much like things were designed intentionally. The universe reeks of design. And that is the biggest, an atheist will tell you, that is the biggest and strongest argument for the existence of God. But three, there are also demonstrable realities you cannot empirically study through the five senses. There are some things you cannot examine under a microscope, such as the laws of logic, mathematics, and ethics. Those cannot be scientifically apprehended or studied. And then fourthly, there's immaterial desires we possess that cannot be satisfied by material objects. There are immaterial desires we all have that cannot be satisfied by material objects, leading us to believe there is some need we have that is outside of material reality. So that was atheism, materialism, and scientism. I think it provides some unlivable conclusions. I think it has some internal inconsistencies, and I think there's lines of evidence that don't quite match up. What about rationalism? Remember, rationalism was the idea that human reason is what we use to uncover all knowledge. Anything that can be known has to be done through the way of human rationalism. But this has an internal inconsistency, I think. The theory that human rationality is the most secure method of obtaining truth, this actually rests upon a circular argument. Because how does one know that their reason is the ultimate trustworthy source of truth? They say, well, I use my reason to figure it out. That's called a circular argument. You claim that your reason is trustworthy because you use your reason to figure it out. This is basically the secular version of an argument that Christians will sometimes make that the secularists will reject. If a secularist says to a Christian, how do you know the Bible is God's word? A Christian will say, well, because the Bible tells me it's God's word. Well, how can you trust what the Bible says? Oh, well, because it's God's word. That's a circular argument. And yet secularists will use the same circular argument when it comes to rationalism. Everything we can know through rationality. How do you know that? Well, I use my rationality to figure that out. Circular argument. Okay, we're almost to the end here. Next is postmodernism, pluralism, and moral relativism. The unlivable conclusions this would provide us with, if these are true, is that we could not make any legitimate moral judgments about the present or the past. If all truth is relative, if all things can be equally true, and if morality is simply relative, simply different people's opinions or perspectives, we could never make any moral judgments on anybody at any time. Now, this is very easily disproved using just one example. If there is even one single ethical issue that a person looks back on and says, this is always wrong and has always been wrong, then immediately moral relativism and postmodernism is disproved. So if you're talking to somebody and you say, do you think rape is wrong? Yes. Do you think it's really wrong? Actually wrong? Yes. Do you think it was wrong when people would invade villages 1,500 years ago and rape the women in those villages? They thought it was fine in their culture. Do you think it was wrong then? Yes. Okay, then you are not a moral relativist. You believe there is this thing called objective good and evil. The only problem you have is you have no source in which to ground that objective good and evil. I do. Why don't you come on over? The water's warm. Okay? So if you ever make even one assumption about one absolute moral standard that people must live up to, moral relativism is disproved. It also is internally inconsistent when we think about pluralism. The law of non-contradiction says contradictory propositions cannot be both true and false at the same time and in the same way. So you have various religions that make absolute claims about God. God is either a personal being or he is not. The law of contradiction says they both cannot be true. Either Jesus is the only way to God or he is not. They cannot both be true. To say they're both true goes against the laws of non-contradiction. And then the claim that there's no absolute truth is actually put forward as a statement of absolute truth. If someone says there's no such thing as absolute truth, you can say, do you believe that's absolutely true? And if they say yes, they've just committed suicide on their own viewpoint. Thirdly, a person who claims that all belief systems, let's go back to that elephant analogy. The person who says all belief systems are simply holding different parts of the elephant, and that if you claim to have a comprehensive view of the elephant, you're arrogant, you're assuming you actually have a very limited perspective, but you're assuming you know the big picture, and religion is the pinnacle of arrogance. Well, that person is actually doing the very thing they're claiming to be against. Because that person who says everything you're feeling is just part of this great big elephant, that person is claiming to have a comprehensive view of the elephant, which is exactly what you said the other blind men should not have been doing. You were calling them arrogant and short-sighted because they claim to have a total view of the elephant. But when you say, I see the entire elephant, you are claiming the same comprehensive view that you are accusing them of arrogantly holding. If we reject all other truth claims on the basis of that elephant analogy, then we have to reject the truth claim that's made by the proponent of the elephant analogy as well. All right? So let's go on to existentialism and humanism. We're almost done, guys. What would be the livable conclusions of existentialism and humanism? If man was not intentioned by an authoritative being, if we are just a minuscule accident in this vast, random, chaotic universe, if we are just hurling towards oblivion with other specks of dust that ultimately will make no difference in the cosmos, how on earth can we assign meaning and value to ourselves? You can tell yourself you're valuable and your life has meaning all you want, but it does not. If you're just a speck of dust hurtling towards oblivion, you can't make yourself have meaning. We can't give ourselves value unless there is someone outside the universe that gives us value. Any insistence that I mean something, my life has value, I have significance, it ultimately makes no difference in the fate of the universe. You can coddle yourself with that all you want. But if there is no creator and authority over us who gave us meaning and purpose, your life has no meaning. You have to be willing to live with that. There's also some internal inconsistencies. Because remember, in existentialism, it says every person is free to create their own meaning and purpose. This is supposed to be a very liberating ideal. Well, what happens if the meaning or purpose that one person sets for themselves interferes with the rights or self-determined purpose of another person? What if I decide my meaning and purpose in life as a totally autonomous being? I'm not accountable to anyone or anything. My purpose in life is to try to kidnap and kill as many people as possible. Well, what happens when that goal interferes with all of the self-determined purpose of all those people that I'm going to kill? You say, well, you can't do that. Well, who are you to say? If now you're telling me the limits of my own purpose and happiness, I'm not really free and autonomous, am I? So the initial claim that we are totally autonomous goes away. So we have to ask ourselves then, well, if there's limits to what the meaning and purpose we pursue, well, who determines those limits? Who made them the authority that decides what those limits are? If there's a group that decides those limits, well, then who is this group? Who decided that this group has the authority? If we can set limits on someone's individual pursuit of happiness, then as it turns out, we're not totally free. We're not totally autonomous. There actually is an authority that presides over our rights and our purposes. If the individual is not totally and truly free, then the whole initial claim of existentialism falls in on itself. The other thing we see is that most of human history has not been marked by recognition of human rights. You understand that? That when we talk about human rights, we kind of take that for granted. The vast majority of civilizations had no recognition of what we call human rights. Now, there were rights for the elite, for the rich, for the aristocrats, that sort of thing, but most people were not given this idea of value or rights. That's unknown throughout most of human history. And that can mean one of two things. Either these categories were made up very recently, in which case they're inventions. The idea of human dignity is not built in to the reality of things. We had to make it up very recently. Or two, they have existed for all time, but most of humanity has suppressed them. And we're presuming that's a bad thing, right? Well, in that case, that goes against the humanist idea that people are basically good. Because if human rights are a real built-in thing that everybody should recognize, well, the sad news is that most of human history has not recognized this idea of human rights, which means most of humanity, for most of human history, has done a very bad thing, which is self-refuting because it refutes the humanist claim that we're actually pretty good on the inside. As it turns out, most of our history is marked by a lot of immorality, this immoral thing. There's also a lack of lines of evidence. Although humans do possess the potential for good in many ways, we also exhibit a strong penchant for evil. You study history, you study psychology, or you simply raise children, and it immediately discredits this idea that humans are naturally good. All right, last thing is that of skepticism. Remember, skepticism was be skeptical about everything. Well, that has some hard livable conclusions because skepticism can only raise doubts. It can never provide answers. And so it leaves you without any solid basis on which to live your life. What is good? What's true? What's worth doing? Skepticism can't answer any of those questions. And so you just spend your entire life lost in this chaotic fog, questioning everything. Life becomes unstable. It becomes unlivable. But it also is internally inconsistent because if a skeptic were to be consistent, he must also be skeptical of his own skepticism. Because he says, the only thing I know for sure is that I can't know these things with any certainty. So you are sure of your own uncertainty. So there's something you're sure of. So now suddenly the whole tenet of skepticism collapses on itself. If we must be skeptical about all knowledge claims, then we must also be skeptical about the skeptic's claim to know that knowledge cannot be known. And so, like postmodernism, like pluralism, like relativism, the skeptic's own standard causes their worldview to commit suicide. Okay, so this was a very basic and very probably headache-inducing flyby of major worldviews and some of the religions attached to them. And throughout this lecture, we have discussed philosophy, which is the rational examination of the big questions. We've examined religion, which is a system of belief about those big questions, about ultimate meaning, how we live in light of that meaning. And we've discussed worldview. Worldview is the lens of philosophy and religion that we wear. It answers those big meaning questions. It colors the way we see the world. And we have used the tools of philosophy to critically examine the inadequacy of some of the major religions and worldviews. Now, in the remaining 6 lectures, we're going to turn our attention to defending Christianity in particular. We've seen, hopefully, that these other major worldviews are not sufficient. We can't stake our life on these things. But Christianity, we can. And in the remaining 6 lectures, we're going to talk about why. Now, what we're going to do in week 7 is we're going to take these same 3 criteria, we're going to apply them to ourselves. Remember, week 7 is going to be all about dealing with objections to Christianity. The skeptics of Christianity who will try to say, here's a problem, here's an error, here's an inconsistency, here's a lack of evidence, whatever. In week 7, we want to answer some of those. We want to hold ourselves to our own standard. And we want to demonstrate that Christianity is consistent, that it is rational, and that there's good evidence for it. So don't forget, if you have a question or a concern, maybe that you have or you've heard about Christianity, things like, why would a good God allow evil and suffering? Or aren't there contradictions in the Bible? Things like that. You can email those to me by no later than week 5, and we will address those in the lecture of week 7. Okay, is everybody still alive? Is everybody ready to go home? All right, well then let's go ahead and let's have a word of prayer, and then we'll go ahead and conclude. Lord, I thank you so much for tonight. I thank you that you are a God of reason and logic. Lord, you are so good and you have made us for yourself, and our hearts are restless until they find their rest in you. Lord, because of sin, we have sought to fill that God need in so many other flawed ways. Lord, that instinct in us has not gone away. We've just tried to satisfy the hunger with all sorts of other false objects. Lord, I ask that you would restore in us the desire for that which is good, that which is true, and that which is beautiful. And that is you, yourself, as you have revealed yourself in Scripture and in your Son, Jesus Christ. I ask that you would equip us with the right way of thinking about the world so that we would be ready to tear down arguments and strongholds of what is false, and that we would be ready to introduce the truth of who you are and what you have revealed through your word and through Jesus. Would you bless the remainder of our night, get everybody home safely, bless us and keep us till we resume back here next week for our next study together. We ask all of this in Jesus' mighty name. Amen.